A boot slammed into the ribs of an old dog. The animal yelped and skidded across the gravel. A second kick came harder, and this time the dog didn't cry out. It turned and sank its teeth into a man's leg. The man screamed. Fists came down on the animal's back again and again, but the jaws held. Now here's the thing. That dog was 13 years old, half blind. And he belonged to a man named Dutch Vaughn, a president of the Iron Ridge Motorcycle Club, 300 miles away, and rolling home a week early with his engine cut. Nobody at that clubhouse knew he was coming. Nobody knew he was close enough to hear a scream carry across the gravel in the dark. What Dutch found waiting behind his own front door would break something in him that no fist ever could. Stay with me on this one. Let me tell you about Dutch Vaughn, because you need to understand the man before you understand what got broken. He was 58 years old, and he'd run the Iron Ridge Motorcycle Club for 22 of them, out of a cinder block clubhouse at the end of a gravel road in Kern County, California. He built the place with his own 2 hands. He buried 2 brothers behind it, Pike and Marcus. Under 2 flat stones he cut himself. And he had one rule above all the others, one line every man who wore the patch knew by heart. You don't sell poison to your own. No pills. No powder. Whatever the club did to keep the lights on, hauling freight, running a garage, the odd job nobody talked about, it never once touched that line. His own sister's boy, a kid he loved, got caught moving powder out the back of the garage once. Dutch cut his colors off, drove him to the county line himself, and never spoke his name again. That's the kind of man he was. The rule was the rule, and it was why the doors stayed open when clubs twice their size folded or went to prison or shot each other to pieces over money. Iron Ridge stayed small, stayed poor some years, stayed clean. Dutch thought that was a fair trade. A man who bends his own rule once has no rule at all. The man he trusted most in the world was his second-in-command, Cal Merrick. The boys called him Preacher because he could talk. Lord, could that man talk. He could talk an angry sheriff into a handshake. He could talk a widow into feeling better at a funeral. Cal had ridden at Dutch's right hand for 15 years. He'd stood up at Dutch's wedding and stood over Dutch's wife's grave 2 years later, and both times he'd found the right words when Dutch had none. Dutch had taken a bullet meant for Cal in a bar outside Bakersfield and carried the scar in his hip ever since, and never once mentioned it. That's how deep it went. If you'd asked Dutch the week before all this to name the one man alive who'd never betray him, he'd have said the name before you finished the question. Now the dog, Diesel. A Rottweiler, 13 years old, gray around the muzzle, half blind in one eye. Dutch raised him from a pup no bigger than a boot, bottle-fed him through a bad first winter when the run of the litter wasn't supposed to make it. That dog slept at the foot of his bed for 13 years. When Dutch's wife was dying, it was Diesel who wouldn't leave the bedroom. And when Dutch rode out, Diesel sat at the gate and waited, sometimes for days, watching the road until the engine came back up it. The whole club knew it. If Diesel was at the gate, Dutch was gone. If Diesel was gone from the gate, Dutch was home. Dutch had gone south 11 days ago to settle a beef between 2 clubs down in Arizona before it turned into a shooting war. 2 crews that had feuded for years over a stretch of desert highway, both itching for a reason. The job was supposed to take 3 weeks, maybe a month. Dutch was good at that kind of work. He could sit in a room with men who wanted each other dead and find the one thing they both wanted more than blood. He got both sides shaking hands in 11 days flat. Even he thought it was easy. Too easy maybe, but he didn't stop to chew on that at the time. He was tired and homesick, so he pointed his bike north and rode home without calling ahead. He wanted his own bed, his own coffee, his old dog at the gate. So here's Dutch, 2 miles out, doing the thing he always does coming home late. He cuts the engine and coasts the last stretch down the gravel in the dark. Old habit from the early years when you never announced yourself until you knew the yard was clean. The bike rolls quiet, just tires on stone and crickets in the brush, and that's when he sees him. Diesel, but not at the gate. The dog was halfway down the road, out in the open, dragging one back leg, limping toward the sound of the bike like it was the last thing left in the world. Dutch was off the bike before it stopped rolling. He went down on his knees in the gravel, got his hands on the dog, and that's when he felt it. A bandage. Clean white gauze wrapped tight and neat around the hind leg. Taped off proper, the way you do it if you cared about getting it right. But it wasn't Dutch. And nobody at that clubhouse knew the first thing about wrapping a wound like that. His men could set a broken chain, not a broken leg. Dutch ran his hand down the dog's ribs and Diesel flinched away, and Dutch felt the heat come up in his own face, bruising under the fur. The kind you get from a boot, not from a fall. Dutch had seen enough beaten animals to know the difference between a dog that got hurt and a dog that got hit. This dog got hit. Somebody stood over an old half-blind animal and put a boot in him, more than once. "Who did this to you?" he said. Quiet. The dog pressed his big gray head into Dutch's chest and shook, the whole body trembling, and something old and cold started to move in him. Dutch looked up the road at his own clubhouse, and something was wrong. 3 trucks in the yard he didn't recognize. Big diesel Julies with out-of-state plates backed in tight like they belonged there. Lights burning in the back office window, the room he kept locked, the room only he had a key to. And music loud enough to carry all the way down the road, which meant nobody was listening for engines. Nobody was on watch. In 22 years, there had never once been a night without a man at that gate. Not one. It was the first rule under the big rule: you keep the gate. Dutch felt the first cold drop of something in his gut. He didn't have a name for it yet, but his hands knew before his head did. They'd gone steady, real steady. The way they went before things got bad, back in the years he didn't talk about. He looked down at Diesel. "Stay behind me," he whispered, though the dog could barely walk. Then he started up the road on foot, leaving the bike in the ditch, moving along the tree line where the dark was thickest. He stood in the shadow of the woodpile and watched his own home through the glass a long minute. He counted 7 men he didn't know. He counted 3 of his own brothers, men who'd sworn an oath on the same floor he had, sitting there among the strangers like it was nothing, drinking with them, laughing. He did not see the one face he was looking for. A kid named Danny. A prospect barely 20, the youngest man in the club. Dutch had taken a chance on that boy when nobody else would, a kid with nothing and nobody, because he saw something honest in him. Danny wasn't at the table. Danny wasn't anywhere. And in the middle of it all, comfortable as a king, one boot up on a chair, laughing with a drink in his hand, sat Cal Merrick. Dutch made a decision. He wasn't going to skulk in the dark outside his own clubhouse. That wasn't him. He told Diesel to stay by the woodpile, and the old dog, for once in 13 years, didn't listen. Diesel stayed at his heel, dragging that leg, teeth bared at the building. Dutch walked up to his own front door and pushed it open. The room went dead quiet. Somebody killed the music. 7 strangers turned to look at the gray-bearded man in the doorway in road dust, and not one of them knew who he was. But his 3 brothers did, and you could watch the color drain out of all 3 faces at once like somebody pulled a plug. Then Cal stood up, and I want you to understand something about Cal. He was smooth. Smoothest man Dutch ever knew. There wasn't a flicker of panic in him. He spread his arms wide and grinned like Christmas morning. "Dutch," he boomed. "Brother, you're home early. Look at this, boy's the old man himself in the flesh." He crossed the room and wrapped Dutch in a bear hug, thumping his back like a drum. And into Dutch's ear, low under the noise, so soft only Dutch could hear it, he said, "You should have called ahead, brother." Dutch didn't hug him back. He was looking over Cal's shoulder at the tables. Not poker chips and beer. little plastic bags, a digital scale, the kind that reads to 1/10 of a gram, blue pills in a sorting tray, hundreds of them, a man in blue gloves counting them into baggies like he had all night. Poison. The one line. Sitting out on the table in his own clubhouse like it was nothing, under the same roof where he'd cut his own nephew loose for a fraction of it. Something happened in Dutch's chest right then that never unhappened. You cross some lines and you can walk them back. That one you can't. He knew, standing in that doorway with his dead brothers in the ground 20 feet away, that whatever this was, it had already gone too far to fix with words. But Dutch was old, and old meant patient. The man who swings first when he's outnumbered 7-3 is the man who bleeds first. He counted the room again. 10 men, 1 door. The arithmetic said wait. So he did the hardest thing there is. He smiled. "Guess I did," he said. "Somebody get me a drink." Cal laughed big and relieved and clapped him on the shoulder. "There he is. Sit down, Dutch. Let me clear some of this out. Been a hell of a week." Cal moved fast. He barked at the strangers and they started sweeping the pills and the scale into a duffel bag. He waved 2 of them toward the door. "We'll finish in the morning. Give the man some room, he's been on the road. Go on." Real casual. Like Dutch walking in on all this was just bad timing, nothing a night's sleep couldn't smooth. Dutch watched every second of it. He watched where the duffel went into the back office, the locked room, the one only he had a key to. Except the door wasn't locked now, and Cal opened it like he'd opened it 100 times. And Diesel, that old dog, dragged himself across the floor past all those legs and lay down right in front of that office door. Not resting, watching it. A low sound in his throat that never quite stopped, that Dutch could feel more than hear. Dutch walked to his own chair at the head of the table and sat down. Cal put a glass of whiskey in his hand. The strangers were leaving now, engines starting in the yard one by one. The 3 brothers were trying to act natural and failing at it, drinking too fast, saying nothing. Cal sat across from him and poured himself a drink like they had all the time in the world. "Man, it's good to have you back," he said. "You would not believe the week I've had holding this place together. Couple of buyers came through, that's all. Legit parts deal gone a little sideways, a little bigger than I figured. Nothing we can't square. I'll walk you through the books tomorrow, coffee and the books, just like always." And here's the thing. For just a second, sitting in his own chair, whiskey in his hand, his old dog on the floor, Dutch almost let himself believe it could be smoothed over. That was the danger. Cal was that good. 15 years of that voice, and the voice knew every door in Dutch's head and which ones opened easy. The trucks rolled out. The yard went quiet. It was just family now. Cal talked, easy and warm, about the runs they'd made and the men they'd buried, and the winter the roof came off, and Diesel's growl had finally gone soft down to nothing, and Dutch felt the whiskey warm in his hand. For about 90 seconds it felt like a homecoming, and then the back office door opened. A man came out rubbing his eyes, shirtless, a pistol shoved in his waistband like he owned the place. He'd been asleep, in Dutch's own bed behind Dutch's own door. He looked at Dutch sitting at the head of the table, and he didn't recognize him either. He looked at Cal. "This the guy," he said, yawning wide. "The one from Arizona, thought Reyes was handling that this week, thought that was already done." The room froze, every glass stopped moving. Cal's face changed, just a flicker. But Dutch caught it, because Dutch had spent 15 years learning to read that face, and he'd never once seen it slip until right then. "Handling what?" Dutch said. Quiet. Nobody answered. The stranger looked around at all the frozen faces and slowly figured out he'd said something he shouldn't have, and his hand drifted back toward his waistband, slow. And Dutch put it together in about 2 seconds flat, the way you do when a thing you couldn't see snaps into focus. The Arizona run. The peace deal that went too easy. 2 clubs that had hated each other for years, blood going back a decade, and Dutch rides in and they fold in 11 days like it was scripted. Because it was. He wasn't sent down there to make peace. He was sent down there to die. Somebody named Reyes was supposed to handle it on a lonely mountain road. A man out of gas. An accident, bad news off a highway nobody watched. And the only man alive who could have arranged that whole trip, who booked it and blessed it and hugged Dutch goodbye at the gate, was sitting across the table from him with a drink in his hand. Cal wasn't smiling anymore. "You sent me down there to get killed," Dutch said. It wasn't a question. Cal set his glass down slow, and when he spoke, the warmth was gone, and what was left was something Dutch had never heard in 15 years, flat and cold, a voice from a stranger wearing his friend's face. "You were supposed to be a phone call, Dutch. Bad news off a mountain road. Clean. You'd have never known a thing. You made it hard by coming home. I gave you a good death and you threw it back at me." Dutch didn't move. His hands were steady on the table. "The pills," he said. "You put poison on our table under this roof, 20 feet from Pike and Marcus." "I put money on our table," Cal shot back, and now the words came fast like he'd been holding them 15 years. "You and your precious code kept this club broke for 20 years. Broke, Dutch. Grown men riding to funerals in trucks that won't start. Those men out there pay. Real money. All they wanted was the road, the yard, a quiet place to run product where no cop looks twice, and a president who'd stay out of the way. I gave it to them. And you know what? The boys ate. First time in years the boys ate real food and paid real rent." He jerked his chin at the three brothers. "Tell him, go on, tell him you're eating." None of them looked up, but none of them stood up for Dutch either. And that told Dutch exactly where the room stood, and it was the coldest thing yet. The shirtless man, Kessler, was awake enough now to feel the danger crawling up the back of his neck. He saw Dutch's steady hands, the way they lay flat and easy on the wood, and something in him read that right where the others hadn't. And men like Kessler solve a problem one way. He went for the gun in his waistband. He never cleared it. 13 years old, half blind, one leg wrapped in gauze, and Diesel came up off that floor like a young dog. 70 pounds of Rottweiler hit Kessler in the chest and drove him back into the wall, and those jaws that had held a man in the dark an hour before closed on the wrist with the gun. Kessler screamed. The pistol hit the floor and spun across the boards, and Dutch moved. 58 years old, and he moved like the man he used to be, the man from the years he didn't talk about. He came up out of his chair, got both hands under the heavy table and flipped it over onto Cal, glasses and bottles and all, and had that fallen gun up off the floor and in his hand before anyone else in the room had drawn a full breath. "Everybody sit down," Dutch said, and the whole room sat down. "If you've come this far with me, you already know this stopped being a story about a dog a while ago. So do me one favor. Hit that subscribe button and stay right here, because what Dutch found behind that office door is the part I really need you to hear." Dutch stood at the head of his own table with a gun in his hand, Kessler bleeding on the floor holding his ruined wrist, Diesel planted over him growling low and steady. Cal shoved the fallen table off himself and got to one knee, smart enough not to stand all the way up. "Where's Danny?" Dutch said. Nobody spoke. "I said, where is Danny?" And that's when the old dog answered him. Diesel left Kessler on the floor and limped across the room to the back office door, dragging that wrapped leg. He put his body square in front of it, faced back into the room, and started to growl low and steady, right at Cal, teeth bared. Then he lifted a paw and scratched at the wood, scratched and whined and scratched again and looked back at Dutch and scratched again. Whatever Diesel had been guarding for who knows how many days, it was behind that door, and it wasn't a duffel bag full of pills. Dutch looked at the nearest of his three brothers, a man named Otis. Big man, been in the club 18 years. "Key," Dutch said, "now." Otis broke. You could see it happen, right there on his face. Whatever he'd talked himself into over the last week, the lie about eating and money and looking the other way, it cracked right down the middle and fell apart. He fumbled a key off a ring with shaking hands, crossed the room, unlocked the back office door and pulled it open. The smell hit first. Then Dutch saw him, Danny, the kid, on the floor in the corner of the storage room past the office, wrists bound with baling wire, one eye swollen shut, lips cracked and gray, and old blood crusted down the side of his face. He'd been in there days, beaten and left in the dark. And down beside him on the floor was a dog bowl, a water dish half full. A first aid kit open with the roll of white gauze half used. The boy had been feeding Diesel. Through the gap under the door, scraps off his own plate, back before they stopped feeding the boy too. And when those men out in the yard kicked that old dog for standing guard where they didn't want him, it was Danny, hands wired, half dead, one eye gone, who talked them into shoving the animal into the storeroom with him for a few minutes, long enough to clean the leg and wrap it with a strip torn off his own shirt and that gauze from the kit. Did it right too. Taped it off proper, the way you do when you care. Then the dog dragged itself right back out to the door and would not leave it. That's who bandaged Diesel. And that's who Diesel had been guarding this whole time, not the pills, not the duffel, the boy. Dutch handed the gun to Otis and told him to keep it on Cal, and Otis did, steady now, glad to have a right thing to do. Dutch cut the wire off the kid's wrists with his own knife. Danny grabbed his sleeve with what strength he had and got the words out through split lips. I heard him, Dutch, on the phone, late 2 weeks back, heard him set up Arizona, heard him say your name and heard him say a price. I tried to get to my bike to ride out and warn you. They caught me at the gate. He coughed, a wet sound. I didn't sign. Whatever they tell you, whatever's on that desk, I never signed it. They put the pen in my hand and I dropped it. Every time. Signed what? Dutch turned. And there on the office desk was a folder, and inside it the deed to the land, the clubhouse, all of it, a bill of sale, the club's charter, the whole of Iron Ridge made over to a shell name Kessler's people owned. Cal was selling the entire thing out from under them. The road, the yard, the shop, the graves out back. All he needed was the founding members' marks on the paper, and Dutch's was the one that mattered, the one the lawyers would want. That's why the phone call in Arizona had to look like an accident. A dead president signs nothing. But a dead president can't say no either, and a founding member's name can be got other ways once the man himself is off a mountain road and in the ground. Dutch stood up with that folder in his hand and looked at his 3 brothers, and now they were looking back at him. Because eating was one thing. A man can tell himself a long, warm lie about eating, about money, about the boys getting by. But a caged boy with wire on his wrists, and a president marked for a ditch, and the deed to their dead brother's ground sold off to strangers who cooked poison on the table. No man at that table had signed up for that, and every single one of them knew it now, in his gut, where you can't lie to yourself. He told you it was buyers, Dutch said, holding up the folder. Told you it was money, a parts deal. Did he tell you he sold the ground Pike and Marcus are buried in? Did he tell you he put a kid in a wire and left him to die in the dark? Did he tell you what Arizona really was? Otis stood up. Then the second brother, a man named Ray. Then the third. They didn't say a word, they didn't have to. They just turned, all 3 of them, slow, and faced Cal Merrick. Cal saw the room turn, saw the last of it go. And a cornered man does one of 2 things. He begs or he swings. Cal had never begged for anything in his life. Cal swung. He came up off the floor with a knife he'd had in his boot the whole time, fast, straight at Dutch. Because Dutch was the one thing standing between him and everything he'd bled 15 years for. He never reached him. Diesel hit him before the brothers did. That old gray dog left the office door he'd guarded for a week, and threw himself the length of the room at the man he'd been growling at all night. And this time, his teeth found the arm with the knife and clamped down and did not let go. Cal went down under 70 pounds of Rottweiler, and then under 3 men who used to call him preacher and mean it. The knife skittered under the fallen table. When they hauled Cal up onto his knees, his nose was broken and running and his eyes were wild, and the smooth was all gone off him for good. He didn't look like a preacher anymore. He didn't look like anything. Dutch stood over him a long moment, that steady hand still holding the gun he never once had to fire. He crouched down slow to Cal's level, knees popping, and looked him in the eye the way he hadn't been able to for 15 years without knowing what he was really looking at. "You had my back for 15 years, he said. "I took a bullet for you outside Bakersfield and never said a word, and you sold all of it for a folder." He shook his head, almost tired. "I'm not going to kill you. That'd be doing you a kindness, and I'm done doing you kindnesses." They took his colors, right there in front of everyone. They cut the Iron Ridge patch off his back with his own boot knife, slow, the way it's meant to be done so a man feels every stitch, and for a man like Cal, that was worse than a bullet, worse than a grave. He'd built his whole self out of those colors. He was nothing without them, and now he'd walk out into the world as nothing, and everyone who mattered would know it. Kessler and his people got a message they understood. Dutch made a call to the one club down in Arizona that still owed him a real debt, the honest one, the men who'd shaken hands in good faith not knowing what the deal was built on. He told them the truth of it. And by sunup the strangers and their trucks and their pills were gone from Kern County for good, and word went out the length of the state that the shell name on that deed was a dead letter, and any man who came looking to collect on it would answer for it. The folder with the deed went into the wood stove and burned down to gray ash while the whole club stood and watched the flames take it, nobody saying a word. That's the part people always want to skip to. The justice, the fight, the bad man on his knees. And I get it, believe me. But that's not the part that stayed with Dutch. The part that stayed with him was the dog. Because here's what Dutch kept coming back to in the quiet days after. Every man in that clubhouse had a choice. Grown men, sworn brothers, men who'd taken an oath on that floor with their hands flat on the charter. And when the money came and the strangers came, 3 of them looked the other way and told themselves a story, and one of them planned a murder and hugged him at the gate. Men lie to themselves. Men eat and call it loyalty and sleep just fine, but that old half-blind dog never once had to think about it. Diesel took a beating in the dark, took a boot in the ribs from grown men, and dragged himself right back to that door and would not leave the boy who needed guarding. He didn't do it for money. He didn't do it because it was smart, and it sure wasn't smart. He did it because the place was Dutch's, and because a scared kid tied to a floor had been kind to him and shared his last scraps, and that was the whole of it. Danny healed up. Took a few weeks, and the eye never came all the way back, and he'd winced turning his head for a while. Dutch patched him in full, no more prospecting, no more proving himself, no more waiting. When they gave him his colors, Dutch said only one thing to the room, and his voice wasn't quite steady saying it. "This one already showed me who he is. He showed me tied to a floor, with nothing to gain and a knife at his throat, and he still didn't sign." And every man there understood, and nobody argued, and Danny wore that patch the rest of his life like it was made of something more than leather. Otis and Ray and the third, Dutch kept. Some folks won't understand that, and I don't blame them. But Dutch had watched them turn back when it counted, watched the lie fall off their faces when they saw the wire on the kids' wrists, and he'd buried enough brothers to know the difference between a man who's rotten all the way down and a man who got lost in the dark and found his way back. They spent a long time earning it back. Years. He never quite trusted them the same, and they knew it, and they took it as fair. That was the price, and they paid it. As for Diesel, the leg never healed all the way right. The vet in town, a real one this time, set what could be set and told Dutch the old dog was living on borrowed time, had been for a while, that the heart wasn't what it was. Dutch just nodded. He'd known that already. He stopped taking the long runs after that. Let the younger men handle the road and the far jobs. He wanted to be home, close to the gate. And on the good evenings, you could find the two of them out at the gate at the end of that gravel road. An old man and an old dog, watching the light go down over Kern County. Diesel couldn't hear an engine coming the way he used to. Couldn't see much out of the one good eye anymore, and the leg dragged. But he'd still lift his gray head toward the road out of habit, the way he had for 13 years, waiting for something to come home. Dutch would put a hand on the broad old back where the bruises had long since faded, and he'd think about that first night. About coasting down the road with his engine cut, and a scream carrying across the dark, and a dog dragging a wrapped-up leg toward the only sound in the world he still trusted. A fist can break a lot of things. Cal proved that. 15 years of a man's trust, gone in one folder and one phone call. But it turned out there was one thing in that whole clubhouse no fist could touch and no money could buy. It had 4 legs and a gray muzzle, and it was lying at the gate right where it always had been, waiting for Dutch to come home. And every single night Dutch did.